Welcome, everyone. It's Friday, April 23rd, Connecticut College. This is the Art 207 Design, Type, and Image class, and we are so thrilled to have Chris Pullman with us today. I'm going to just go through a quick bio. Chris Pullman received his BA in history from Princeton University in 1963, then attended the graduate program in graphic design at Yale, where he earned his MFA in 1966. After that, he began teaching in the graduate and undergraduate programs at Yale, an affiliation that he still maintains regularly today as a senior critic with a focus on motion design. In 2002, Chris was honored with the AIGA Medal, which is the American Institute of Graphic Arts, folks, for a lifetime of contributions to the practice and teaching of design. For 35 years, Chris served as Vice President of Design for WGBH, a major supplier of programs and web content for PBS. He and his design team were responsible for the visual personality of WGBH, as expressed through its on-air titles, credits, and animation, classroom materials, and interactive media. During this time, Chris states, the huge variety of new media coming online made it a fascinating environment to work in. If you are a PBS viewer, you may recognize my work in the opening title sequences of Masterpiece Theater and the Antiques Roadshow, and the WGBH animated on-air signature, which is used at the end of every program produced by the Boston station. During the last 5 years of my time at WGBH, I helped to plan and design a whole new headquarters and studio complex in Brighton, which you can see along the Mass Pike heading into Boston. Since retiring from WGBH in 2008, he continues to teach, critique, and lecture at various schools, and you are seriously pursuing a painting career now. Which is really exciting and beautiful work. So more about Chris. All of his work and his writings can be found at christopherpullman.com, and I'll just type that in here. There, you guys can look at that later. Chris, it is such a treat to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's very special for me. So Chris was one of my senior critics in grad school back in 1988 to 1990. And yeah, just good memories. So it's all yours, Chris.
So Anna, do you have enough to go around for everybody?
My last piece of bread. I don't.
Well, I'm very happy to sort of see and meet all of you. I wish I was there in person, but so be it. I'm going to talk to you today about a designer that's less well known than he should be. And for that purpose, I'm going to share my screen. So in the summer of 1991, it was a rented cottage up north of Boston on Cape Ann, which is a rocky headland that's separated from the mainland by the Annisquam River, which you see here. Our first dog, named Pica, was pregnant and expecting her first litter of puppies. As the 4th of July approached, she was clearly about to pop. The night of July 2nd, she spent the whole night on our bed, panting. The next morning, sure enough, she jumped into the whelping box we had prepared for her and began to deliver her puppies. I don't know how many of you have watched this kind of activity, but it's really amazing. Kids from all over the neighborhood came around to watch, and eventually she produced 3 puppies, 2 boys and a girl, all about the size of baked potatoes. For the first 2 weeks, their eyes are closed, their ears are closed, and they're just little eating and sleeping machines. Pica was a wonderful mother, feeding them, cleaning up after them, and proudly showing them off. She would nurse, and we would weigh them on the kitchen scale every day, and they would get bigger. Soon they were alternately running around the place and falling asleep in a ball. After about 6 weeks, we set the table for their first real meal. They get bigger really fast. By the time we had figured out what to call them, and because of their color, we named them oatmeal, wheat cakes, and cinnamon loaf. This is oatmeal conked out in his water dish. That summer, like many summers, one of our visitors was Dan Friedman. He had planned his visit very carefully to correspond with the moment of maximum puppy cuteness. His timing was perfect, and he arrived laden with pastel dog toys. Dan was a regular visitor through the 80s and 90s, an escapee from New York, happy with the simple pleasures of this place, doing what we did, digging clams on the sandbar, sailing to the candy store, picking raspberries for picnic, or taking a swim in the cold water. 2 years later, in 1993, he came with his friend Laurie Millay and hung out for several days. He was in great spirits, about to start teaching again after a long lapse, this time at Cooper Union in New York. During his visit, he showed us sketches for the book he was preparing on his work in philosophy. We pored over the pages, fussing over wording, debating the sequence. The following year was published a beautiful compilation of his work and writing over a period of 30 years. That fall, he unveiled the carefully planned traveling exhibit of 104 framed images of his work. 4 months later, he was in the hospital. He died on July 8th, 1995, after an illness he had concealed for almost a decade, 12 days short of his 50th birthday. For over half his life, we watched his curious and influential career unfold. Our close and comfortable relationship at the end of his life wasn't always that way. What follows is a very personal overview of Dan's fascinating and evolving practice as a teacher, designer, artist, activist, author, and cultural philosopher. For many of you, it may provide you an introduction to an influential figure, less well known than he should be. And it will reveal a personal philosophy of life and work as insightful and relevant today as it was 20 years ago. No, 27 years ago. Oddly, and in hindsight, we seem to be shadowing Dan before we actually met him. In March 1967, my Yale classmate Esther and I got married and decided to take our honeymoon in Switzerland, which was then the mecca of modern graphic design. The preceding year, on another trip to Switzerland, I had met some students from Ulm, a German design school which had inherited the mantle of modernism from the Bauhaus. And we met up with them in Zurich. And we decided to take a trip to the school on our way to go skiing. Ulm was an austere and serious place, focused on semiotics and what would now be called information theory, like a monastery filled with political activists. Like the Bauhaus, it was philosophically committed to a unified, socially oriented approach to products, graphics, and architecture. Among his faculty were great designers and theoreticians like Max Bill, Maldonado, Neuberg, Müller-Brockmann, and their journal, Die Neue Grafik, would become the Bible of mid-century modernism. What we didn't know at the time was that Dan was there too. When Dan was in his last year at Carnegie Mellon, a new faculty member named Ken Hebert, who later started the Philadelphia College of Art, fresh from the Swiss Allgemeine Gewerbeschule at Basel, revealed a side of design that was very different from the prevailing commercial art training that characterized Carnegie Mellon and most schools at that time. Dan applied for and won a Guggenheim Fellowship to study in Europe, and he chose to go to Ulm. But when the school collapsed in political strife a year later, Dan transferred to Basel, where his teacher had gone to school. Again, by chance, Esther and I would also be in Basel that summer of 1968. As a new teacher at Yale, I had been given the fellowship to study the Basel program and see what it offered for our own curriculum. Strangely, while Dan was there, we don't actually remember seeing him or meeting him. Basel presented a very different kind of environment from Yale. Long classes focused on drawing, color, and fundamental exercises. Seemingly endless revisions made to Plaka studies. It was all about process. I remember when I was there watching this woman painting and painting and painting on her piece of cardboard. And when I came in the next morning, she had painted the whole thing out white and started over. Key among the school's many gifted teachers was Armin Hoffman. Here he is critiquing a poster project. Hoffman had been a periodic visitor to Yale since the 50s. I had met him there, and he welcomed us for a 6-week stint to experience the school. And it was there we also met a young typography teacher in his first year at Basel. His name was Wolfgang Weingart, a classically trained German typographer in his white lab coat, who had come to study under Emil Ruder, a revered modernist typographer who was the director of the school. Weingart was steeped in the rigorous underpinnings of contemporary Swiss-German typography, but suspicious of its impersonal, reductive bias. His personal work was searching for a more expressive, less dogmatic approach, and he found a like-minded and talented student in Dan Friedman. While it's tempting to lump all Swiss design in the 60s into one category, that's really misleading. The school in Zurich and Basel, while an hour apart, were conceptually very different. Müller-Brockmann and the school in Zurich were more linked to the tradition of Ulm, cool, rational, systematic, scientific, and applied. Hoffman and Basel, by comparison, seemed more humane, intuitive, introspective, drawing and craft-based, imbued with a kind of aestheticism, leavened, it should be said, by Weingart's arrival, which brought a new and unconventional experimental energy to the school. Although superficially similar from the vantage point of America, these two pedagogical and formal approaches were diverging at the end of the 60s, when Dan was a student there. And so it came to be that in January of, 1970, On Armin Hoffman's recommendation, and fresh from 2 rigorous years of postgraduate study in Europe, Dan arrived at Yale to teach. A strange, shy character in a tight blue suit, gray shirt, black tie, with a shock of fuzzy hair and a peculiar, halting speech pattern. He came loaded with these 2 different design influences: the austere, reductive, elegant restraint typical of his experiences with Ulm, Emil Ruder, and Hoffman, juxtaposed with the playful, intuitive troublemaker side, encouraged by Weingart and Dan's own persona. This dichotomy would fascinate him throughout his career as a teacher and a practitioner, and fuel a continuous process of reconciliation between his deep faith in the progressive aspirations of modernism and his sense that this philosophy had to evolve in order to account for the chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous, diverse, and ridiculous reality of the world he was inhabiting in the last quarter of the century. In 1970, when Dan arrived at Yale, the graduate program in graphic design, he encountered an impressive home team. Paul Rand, one of the most well-known and formidable of American designers; Herbert Matter, a quiet and intuitive designer and photographer who emigrated from Switzerland in the 30s to help establish the tenets of European modernism in America; Bradbury Thompson, the dean of magazine designers, a link to the traditions of printing and book design; Norman Ives, a graduate of the very first Yale design class in 1950, and an avid collector and artist whose own formal aesthetic informed his teaching. And then there was Walker Evans, a wry and literate character whose work as a photographer in the 30s transformed American photography. And the director, Alvin Eisenman, whose encyclopedic interests and uncanny ability to sense how the discipline was changing had guided the graphic design program at Yale since its inception in 1950. As Armin's protege, Dan had some credibility with this crowd, but his age and his certainty about his own ideas of how and what to teach didn't sit well with some of the old guard. I was the junior faculty member at the school, and while I sort of liked Dan, his sense of superiority, no matter how well founded, irked me. When Armin would come for periodic workshops, they would resort to Schweizerdeutsch, close up like a private club. I would listen to his well-founded notions of how to run a school, feeling the underlying condemnation of my own training, which, measured against the rigorous, highly refined philosophy of Basel, appeared haphazard and defective. His certainty about my professional deficiencies undermined my own confidence as a teacher and made me wary of his friendship. Nevertheless, in 1971, I was asked to help define the graphics curriculum for the new New York State University of the Arts at Purchase. I decided to invite Dan to join me, and we had a productive collaboration. And for the next few years, we both taught in the same program we had designed. Dan also created the first and still intact identity for the school. Dan arrived at a chaotic time for Yale and for the country in general. Remember, this was 1970. Kent State, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King had been gunned down. Berkeley, Columbia, and Harvard had all been shut down by student strikes, protesting Vietnam and civil rights abuses. Yale was in the middle of its own version of this crisis, the spring that Dan arrived. The art school mysteriously went up in flames late one night with the local paper reporting arson. A year later, National Guard troops were staked out across the street from the burned out art school, anticipating a May Day riot. In his book, Dan writes that while the country was in turmoil, quote, it was also a time of liberation, idealism, and experimentation, a time considered by many to be a cultural turning point. And indeed it was. In his revolutionary book, architect Robert Venturi had thrown down the gauntlet, challenging the core tenets of modernism with his pronouncement that less is a bore, not less is more. The incoming dean of architecture at Yale was a guy named Charles Moore. Idiosyncratic and high-spirited, Moore agreed with Venturi's slogan that less is a bore. His experiments on his own house in New Haven opened up a whole new vocabulary of graphic, color, and spatial ideas. And Venturi himself was invited to Yale. He put together a groundbreaking multidisciplinary studio called Learning from Las Vegas, which saw the crass, bizarre structures of the Las Vegas Strip as exhilarating and legitimate architectural response to place. The study opened the profession's eyes to the vitality of vernacular forms and indigenous structures, and encouraged designers, in Dan's words, to express rather than exclude the dumb and fractured context of the real world. All this was the larger intellectual and formal phenomenon known as postmodernism that would spread from literature and architecture to many other fields. In his book, Dan reflected on how all these influences affected him. This is very interesting. Listen to what he wrote. I found an analog to these issues in my own field of visual communications. I was attracted to the spareness, abstraction, and Zen-like purity of characteristic of orthodox modernism. But I was also intrigued by more hidden complexities, by the vernacular, by working against the rigidity, boredom, and exclusiveness that were increasingly associated with modernism. Most important, I was not prepared to see these points of view as inherently contradictory. I began to think about a reconceptualized modernism, he continued, more radical in that it would not only accommodate order along with chaos, but would embrace a variety of other conditions, no longer paired as dichotomies. These ideas were reflected in the projects Dan brought to the program at Yale. Problems that typically involve the collision of two overlapping systems, the structured and the free, conceptual and the intuitive, the modernist and the radical. Dan was a good teacher, exotic, demanding, but liked by most of his students. In one case, he introduced a classic Basel formula, starting with a fixed grid. He asked students to make a simple operation on the grid, like flattening a particular horizontal. Then to gradually expand that variant in a series of logical steps until the underlying grid is overwhelmed by the new idea. The last composition added the letters CITY to contextualize the abstracted formal idea. In another, he started with a bland message, in this case, the weather report. He asked the students to experiment with gradually making the message dysfunctional, an odd idea in the modernist mindset, but it had to do with this notion that typography, and other kinds of messages as well, had two dimensions: legibility, that is, can I read it? And readability, am I interested in reading it? To paraphrase Dan, the goal of legibility suggests the use of conventions designed to optimize communication between the sender and the receiver. Conventions that would make the message orderly, simple, static, maybe even banal, in the service of clarity, like this weather report. This mode assumed the reader to be relatively passive recipient. On the other hand, readability engaged an opposing set of conditions, such as disorder, complexity, dynamism, originality, and I would add wit. Conditions which promote interest, pleasure, and challenge in reading. This is the same message. The weather report problem asked the students to explore that fine balance between legibility and readability, between can I read it and do I want to read it, and encouraged them to embrace the entire spectrum from legibility to illegibility, rather than take sides on one end or the other. Dan described these problems for graduate students as advanced fundamentals, simple but deep. Dan felt students needed a methodology for understanding contemporary typography, and he set about to codify one. While critics of the Basel system often carped that its students emerged as clones, knowing only one formal language, Dan was determined to create a design methodology that would be seen as a foundation of, not a replacement for, personal expression. Typical of his intense, directed process of working, within a few years he had published his thoughts on his methodology. These are spreads from the Visible Language, then one of the few critical design journals in the US. Dan not only affected Yale's curriculum, he also practiced what he preached. In addition to turning out memorable work for local organizations, he somehow convinced the dean to try a new, unconventional look on the school's admissions materials, seen by hundreds of potential applicants each year. Meanwhile, Wolfgang Weingart, Dan's former teacher in Basel, had also been perfecting his own experiments with a so-called new typography. And around the end of 1971, I began to see in the library issues of TM, the magazine of the Swiss typographic industry, with amazing covers that he had produced. They had for us at that time a kind of energy and fascinating formal logic that felt invigorating and naughty. In the year 1972, the next year, Dan arranged for Weingart to tour the US, lecturing at scores of schools, including Yale. He offered a carefully thought out alternative to the canons of high European modernist typography, amusingly titled, How One Makes Swiss Typography. And a second tour came the next year. This trip, and the second one, suddenly turned Weingart into a cult figure in the US and kick-started student interest in his typographic experiments. Coincidentally for this story, one of Weingart's TM covers from 1972 featured a picture of Basel pupil April Greiman under the romantic and very Wolfgang-like headline, I Am Feeling Typography. Dan, like April, had been one of Wolfgang's star students, and after graduation had landed at Philadelphia College of Art, now the University of the Arts, the place that was founded by Dan's teacher back at Carnegie Mellon. and she was asked to take the place of a departing visiting faculty member. Ironically, that departing person was Dan. They met, hit it off, and not very long after, April arrived in New Haven. There they rented a little bungalow in Branford, outside of New Haven. And April designed the moving announcement. Esther and I would visit them there, the place filled with stuffed cloth boulders and painted rocks, the first inklings of Dan's later domestic decor. Dan and April were alike in many ways, incredibly gifted, taught by the same teachers and ambitious missionaries of the new typography. But while Dan was intellectual, methodical, and focused, April was intuitive, impulsive, and spiritual. Dan taught April about method and meaning. April taught Dan about designing from the heart. Sure enough, they got married and began to accumulate notable projects like this jointly designed poster for the Yale Symphony. Asked in 1994 by an interviewer about the connections between the two of them and Wolfgang, Dan replied, "We all influenced each other. We all had egos that were so large, they became incompatible. Nonetheless, there were a lot of similarities in what we pursued." I think it's fair to say that the three of them, Dan and April, inspired by Weingart's pioneering teaching, and with assists from other Basel graduates like Ken Hebert, Billy Kuntz, Philip Burton, led the way for a generation of what came to be called new wave typographers and designers, less steeped in the traditions of classical modernism and inspired by the changing culture of the 70s and 80s to employ a more playful, surface-oriented formal language. For a complex of reasons, Dan and April's marriage didn't stick. April split for the New Age mecca of Southern California, hitched up with photographer Janie Odgers to design this Olympic poster, and began producing spirited work for Wet Magazine, the magazine of beach culture, and show off gravity-defying materials for CalArts, where she begins to teach. By the early 80s, she and Dan were in peak form on different coasts, widely published, and their influence could be felt in the groundbreaking work of other designers following a similar path that led away from the formal conventions of high Swiss modernism. Designers like Catherine McCoy and Michael McCoy at Cranbrook, where they designed this poster in the 80s that read, "See the text and read the picture." And their students, Alan Horry and Scott Makala, Nancy Skolos and Tom Waddell. In their influential periodical Emigre, Susanna Litzko and Rudy Vanderlands presented endless digital typographic innovations, like the eccentric and off-kilter template Gothic by Barry Deck. Jeff Keedy and Lorraine Wild began practicing in LA and spreading the word at CalArts with April Greiman. This gene pool begun by Weingart, Dan, and April, eventually begot David Carson and finally Ed Fella, the master of the artless vernacular, about as far from Basel and Ohm and the Bauhaus as you could get. So a new chapter in my relationship with Dan began in 1974. That was when Esther and I moved from New Haven to a little apartment in Cambridge. I began working for WGBH, the public station in Boston, and Esther took a design position at the architecture firm Cambridge 7. Simultaneously, same year, Dan left for New York. Distance and the breakup with April and the pressures of professional commitments put a damper on our relationship, and we fell largely out of touch. Dan's move to New York was partly a rebound from his split with April, I think, but also for another reason. Actually, two reasons. One was a disagreement with the direction of the program at Purchase, too radical for a bunch of straight thinkers, but also for a different and unusual reason. Unlike Basel, where figures like Armin Hoffman and Kurt Howard proudly devoted the bulk of their professional life to mastering the art of teaching, Yale's longtime bias for its graduate teachers was for practicing professionals like Rand and Matter. People like Dan and his Basel-trained colleagues like Inga Druckery and Philip Burton, both of which taught at Yale, felt the ironic pressure to make it in the big-time design world in order to be fully respected as a teacher. So Dan moved to the Big Apple and joined the design firm of Anspach, Grossen and Portugal to prove his mettle, and he did. He took on one of the huge archetypal modernist corporate image programs of the 70s for Citicorp, with scant experience with a project of this scope and political complexity. It was a monster. His meticulous vision for the global bank was codified in elegant posters and a thick manual creating templates for every imaginable application, so talentless lackeys around the world could apply the modernist veneer of Citicorp flawlessly. Next was an invitation to join the new Manhattan office of Pentagram, the classy London-based studio. Dan became the first associate there, US associate. And while he turned out a number of important projects for Pentagram, like the new branding for the public radio station WNYC and an elegant system of packaging for Baumwood Teller, it wasn't a perfect fit for him. Instead of bringing in the big Citicorp-style clients to Pentagram, he gravitated towards smaller, unprofitable, but enjoyable freelance jobs for his friends in the fashion industry. This eventually put him at odds with Pentagram's formal commercial studio model. He began to be much more inspired by the late-night club circuit in New York than his day job as a designer at Pentagram. And in a few years, he left Pentagram for good. Then everything changed. He shaved his head, purged his body with a macrobiotic diet, openly embraced a homosexual lifestyle, and joined the downtown art scene. Perhaps it was no accident that just as he began turning away from the commercial design world and into the world of art, he adopted the appearance of the great artist, designer, pioneers, and experimenters of the Bauhaus, like Johannes Itten on the left and Oskar Schlemmer. As Stephen Holt, in his essay in Dan's book, has observed, as Dan began to pursue projects of personal meaning rather than professional interest at the end of the 70s, his life increasingly took on the dimensions of an experiment rather than a career. Nowhere was this more apparent than in his apartment, a nondescript one bedroom on the 15th floor of 2 Fifth Avenue. For over a decade, beginning in the late 70s, he transformed almost daily this domestic space into a laboratory for experimentation with color, form, materials, and meaning. After years of only sporadic news from Dan, one Sunday morning in 1978, I picked up the New York Times Magazine, and there he was. In the article, see, there's There are those pillows. In the article, Dan explained it this way. I have for many years used my home to push modernist principles of structure and coherency to their wildest extreme. I create elegant mutations, radiating with intense color and complexity, in a world that is deconstructed into a goofy, ritualistic playground for daily life. For me, these incredible environments are among his most remarkable work, spawning ideas for screens, furniture, and assemblage. I visited there a number of times. His inspirations for these environments had to include the rude and energetic graffiti on the New York subways at the end of the 70s, the trash structures he encountered on his trips with his buddies to the Caribbean. It also drew on the deep memory of Kurt Schwitter's Märzbau, a similar decade-long experiment with a domestic space in the 20s and 30s to turn his apartment environment into a work of art. These influences seem to tap into the deeper cultural shift beginning to be felt in the beginning of the 80s. From neat to messy, from newness and originality to appropriation and transmutation. The same shifts were brought to us the beat-up fantasy worlds of Road Warrior and Blade Runner, both of which came out at the same time. Appropriating the detritus of New York streets, Dan made old stuff new, and like Duchamp before him, he endowed dumb objects with new meanings and turned trash, as he would say, into tribal objects of domestic utility. These culturally loaded objects, like this decorated lamp with a rattan skirt, commemorating the scary partial nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, grew out of Dan's fertile experiments in his apartment. These experiments gave rise to a range of what he called ridiculously practical furniture and revived the art of the painted screen with treatments from the austere to the outrageous. Like Picasso and Braque, he employed the art of assemblage, a trusty modernist device for managing visual diversity and altering meaning throughout bizarre juxtaposition. By the mid-80s, early 80s, Dan had begun to fill galleries with radiant post-nuclear evocations. After a decade of spotty contact, he called me up in 1984 out of the blue with an invitation to his opening at the Fun Gallery. With considerable apprehension, I decided to venture down. And there he was, the new Dan, fluorescent in his striped day-glow suit and pork pie hat, smiling amid a sea of big hair and aggressive personas. In just a few years, Dan had made good on his special vow to experience a whole new side of culture, one he found full of energy, fantasy, and optimism. Dan's transition out of design and into the world of art was facilitated by his friendship with a guy named Keith Haring, a young, brash kid from rural Pennsylvania who took New York by storm in the beginning of the 80s with his subway drawings. And like Andy Warhol, a generation earlier, Haring was so naturally talented, so in tune with the temper of the culture, so charismatic and energetic and prolific, that he drew around him a circle of like-minded eccentrics. Within this circle were talents of all persuasions, musicians, designers, poets, performance artists, DJs, filmmakers, and photographers. There's Keith on the left and Dan on the right. An eccentric, wrote Dan in his book, is one who devotes his or her entire persona to willfully, creatively, and positively expanding our view of the world. This was a definition that Dan obviously also employed to help explain himself and his philosophy. Emerging from the corporate climate of Pentagram, where his own developing eccentricities were barely tolerated, Dan was welcomed into Keith's circle as a kind of wise elder statesman. Keith Haring was everything Dan was not. Facile, spontaneous, loquacious, unschooled in traditional design, and their mutual admiration fueled both an intimate friendship and a professional collaboration on the catalogs, products, and books that were the byproducts of Haring's sudden fame. These products and projects helped make Keith a household name, and coincidentally, assured Dan that his skills as a designer were just as valuable in this new world as in the old one. During this period, Dan was able to bridge his worlds of design and art through a series of other publications. Two particularly outstanding projects were done for the gallery owner and curator, Jeffrey Deitch. For two different shows, this is the first one, Artificial Nature, Deitch asked Dan to create a visual essay, not a written essay, but a visual essay as an introduction to the catalog. For Artificial Nature, Dan started by reading the curator's lead essay and isolating keywords and phrases that spoke to the title of the exhibit. And these words and phrases he then paired with fragments of provocative images that he researched. In this process, Deitch's words and ideas were recontextualized by their new visual surroundings, producing a wry and original prologue for the show itself. These juxtapositions are full of irony and energy and bring a new level of meaning to Deitch's words. He used a similar process in Post-Human, and together these two visual essays revealed Dan's impressive talent not only for making images, but for finding them in a pre-Google search era. Their power is a testament to how tuned in Dan was in his new life to the images and art and ideas of popular culture. Despite a remarkable outpouring of work in many different media, Dan never quite got the notoriety that his friend Keith Haring did, or others in his circle like Jeff Koons and Michel Basquiat. His friend and industrial designer and editor Stephen Holt said it was because Dan remained uncategorizable. Too three-dimensional for graphics publications, too arty for design publications, too freeform for craft publications, and too functional for art journals. It's even possible that he was more widely known as an artist and designer in Europe than in his own country. In Italy, for example, his work was frequently published, and it attracted the attention of a band of Milanese designers and architects who called themselves the Memphis Group. Led by Ettore Sotsas, in the early 80s, they began to produce sensual, highly decorative, and zany objects. The Memphis designer, as one journalist wrote, thinks of design as a semantic event, charging an object with cultural information, making it a metaphor or an active presence rather than a dull, opaque support for functions. Well, the same could be said about Dan's wacky furniture. Memphis on the left, Dan on the right. The formal language and playfulness of Memphis was entirely compatible with the objects that grew out of Dan's experiments in his apartment. He went on to execute a number of commissions in Italy, including this shiny handoid and a series of playful flower pots. In Paris, Gallery Neotu issued several editions of his furniture in the 1990s, including the bulky blue sofa. Then a major show planned for Dan at the Pompidou Gallery in Paris was suddenly and tragically derailed by a labor strike. As Dan miraculously transformed himself in the 80s, our relationship was gradually transformed as well. As his repertoire increased, he seemed to become ever more tolerant and inclusive. It's not that he changed his standards, just that more things became okay, including us. Paradoxically, as he became outwardly more and more different from us, our connections grew more and more familiar. This is when he began to visit us in Annisquam with regularity. This is when he visited the puppies. He was an exotic presence in this staid, old-fashioned place, decked out in pink high tops and a Budweiser hat. But he seemed to love it there, hanging out on the porch, watching the sunset. Lots of things change, he once said, but you and Esther seem to stay the same. Still married, still conventional. And he seemed reassured by that. Largely, I think, because his own adventure into the art scene, while exhilarating and productive, was also exhausting and dangerous. In the end, as a student and a teacher, and a designer and artist, what set Dan apart and accounts for the amazingly diverse and coherent body of work that he made is that Dan didn't pursue a style, he pursued an approach. An approach, wrote Stephen Holt, and now listen to this is really important. An approach is a series of investigative questions one asks during the design process, whereas a style is a series of similar looking answers to whatever question is being asked. Dan's approach was based on a conviction about the bedrock values of modernism and its appropriateness, even to today's world. Near the end of his book is a key chapter called "What is Wrong with Modernism?" In it, he answers his own question and lays out his vision of a new kind of modernism that combined the best of the humane, pro-social aspirations of the early 20th century with what he called the exhilarating, ridiculous, diverse, chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous reality of the life that he had led near the end of the century. As a coda to this talk, I think it's worth paraphrasing his argument. And I want you to listen how clearly this argument springs from his own personal experience. He started by saying that many people today think that modernism is a style. That modernism is a style, and that style began at the Bauhaus and fell to disrepute in the 70s and 80s. But modernism was not a style, it was an approach. In his book, Dan chose to peg the beginning of modernism in the mid-19th century. But actually, this philosophy emerged most visibly at the Bauhaus in Germany in the 20s. The school attracted an amazing collection of practitioners, artists, and teachers, including Gropius, Klee, Moholy-Nagy, Kandinsky, Albers, and the aforementioned Schlemmer and Itten. Together, they developed an approach to form and function that produced such a coherent body of work and experimentation that over time it became generalized by art historians as a style. Modernist style was characterized by purity of form, simplicity of purpose, and efficiency of manufacture. But equally as important, Dan points out, the Bauhaus produced a methodology of teaching. This feature of the Bauhaus facilitated the spread of its philosophy and practice around the world to, among other places, Ulm, Basel, and in a diluted form, Yale, and many other schools. But what Dan saw when he emerged from these schools was that designers were obsessed with modernism, with modernist form for its own sake, detached from its original social engagement or philosophical underpinnings. The visual trappings of modernism so perfectly fit the self-image of global business that by then the industry had co-opted the style as its own, dished out to eager corporations by serious and profitable design studios. Modernism, he lamented, sacrificed its claim to moral authority when designers began to sell it as corporate style. So, Dan, whose experiments had taken him from student to teacher to corporate designer to hip-hop groupie to artist, struggled through this period to reconcile his own personal experiences with the original pro-social positivistic tenets of modernism that were so crucial to his worldview. Many of us, he wrote, attempted to reevaluate traditional modernist ideas while introducing within their framework diverse culture, history, and fantasy. Near the end of his book, Dan offers a 12-point manifesto as wise and optimistic today as it was when he wrote it in 1994. Think about this advice as you contemplate your own career and your own education. Live and work with passion and responsibility. Have a sense of humor and fantasy. Try to express personal, spiritual, and domestic values, even if culture continues to be dominated by corporate marketing and institutional values. Choose to be progressive, don't be regressive. Find comfort in the past only if it expands insight into the future, and not just for the sake of nostalgia. Embrace the richness of all cultures. Be inclusive, not instead of exclusive. Think of your work as a significant element in the context of a more important, transcendent purpose. Use your work to become advocates of projects for public good. Attempt to be a cultural provocateur. Be a leader rather than a follower. Engage in self-restraint. Accept the challenge of working with reduced expectations and diminished resources. Avoid getting stuck in corners, such as being a servant to increased overhead, careerism, or narrow points of view. Bridge the boundaries that separate us from other creative professions and unexpected possibilities. Use the new technology, but don't be seduced into thinking they provide answers to fundamental questions. And Be radical. Thank you. I'm gonna unshare,
Okay.
and I'm back again.
Chris, thank you so much. It's an amazing life that he led.
It is.
Really outstanding, and for you to be so much a part of it, and to be able to document that. Students.
It's just those funny things that happen to you, you know, out of the blue.
Remarkable, really.
I think what's so useful today is to be aware of these different ways of having a career in design. And Dan's was so flexible, so driven by his own personal philosophy of life and work. And, you know, it's just something to think about as you ponder what you want to do with your education and your life. Did anybody have any questions about this guy? Yes. Anna has a question.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
You're very welcome.
Professor Bernard is my advisor.
Oh!
I just thought I would let you know.
My condolences.
Thank you. My question is, what do you think Dan's trajectory was or would have been if he hadn't passed away?
You know, I've thought about that a lot because I think that he was at this moment when he had codified his own personal thinking about design as a profession and as a cultural force. He was just about to start teaching again at Cooper Union, and in that process would influence a whole new generation of students coming out in the 90s, and would have experienced for himself this incredible change that happened with the introduction of the internet, social media, and so on. So I don't know exactly how he would have used these features of the information environment, but he was completely clear about his own values, what he wanted to do with his time and his life. And it was just a shame. I mean, he was sick for a long time. We later discovered because he never would talk about it. He never brought it up, but he was in the middle of the AIDS crisis from the early 80s when he made that decision to enter that world until his death. And he had the drive and the self-discipline to say, I want to codify my thinking about design and where it's headed. And he wrote this book, designed it, got it published by Yale Press, and it's a terrific book. I hope you have a copy there?
There should be one in the library.
If you don't, I have a couple in my basement, so I could send them to you. But it's interestingly made, and beautifully illustrated, and more than anything, written with such feeling and such. He was so convinced about the need to redefine modernism in a way that made sense to the contemporary world, And he felt he could do that, and he did it. He also, at the same time, produced a traveling exhibition I mentioned. And Dan's brother, who lives out in California, and I have staged his exhibit in various iterations at schools and museums around the country. So if you know of any place that would like to have the exhibit, I'll give you my phone number. Other things that made you think about? Another thing I would mention, just by the by, that graphic design is the only design discipline with its roots in language. And it's so important to be able to write and speak that language and to understand how to use it to inform and influence people through communications. And that's what we do. Words and images brought together in the same space to create an idea or express a certain kind of information or message. And so language, you know, you're in a school that believes in a holistic education, not just going to art school, and take advantage of it. Learn how to be a researcher, learn how to write clearly, and experiment. Andrea, I think your particular approach to the teaching of design is quite unique, as I understand it, among people who claim to be doing this, and I think does involve students more heavily in that aspect of design thinking and research than a lot of other schools do, and I think that's commendable. How is Bernard as a painting teacher?
Who's had Professor Bernard?
Whoa, look at them all.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is my nephew.
He's
And sorry?
I was just going to say he's an incredible colleague and excellent teacher and a very good chair of the department. And I hope he'll stay chair for a long time. So I'm just plugging that. I know he doesn't want to.
For me, it was just extremely weird to watch his college career because for the longest time, it appeared that his primary interest was full court frisbee. He went to the Nationals, basketball, and a few other things. And then one day he announced that he decided that he was going to be an art major. And we all said, what? It's interesting, the first thing that he painted, well, maybe not the first thing, but he painted this amazing variation on the Sweet 16 grid, you know, down to the finals. You got to see it. It's classic. Anyway, it's another story, another lecture.
Another lecture. Xavier, you have a hand up.
Yeah, so I was wondering about, so the differences between style and approach. You said that there's like, the distinguishing point is that an approach is like a question, and correct me if I'm wrong, and style is like sort of an answer, right?
Yeah. The quotation in the book is really a good one, but it makes the distinction between something you already know that is applied to something that you don't.
Mm-hmm.
or a series of questions that you ask in order to figure out what to do. And the approach is the latter. The idea that that you should be a one-trick pony is really tricky, because every single problem that you face as a designer is going to be totally different. Even if it's in the same industry or the same zone, the conditions are going to be different, the context is different, the people running the organization are different. And so it's much better not to have a presupposition about the formal solution that will be applied to this problem. And that's the distinction.
Okay. And you said that Bauhaus is an approach and modernism is approach, right?
Well, modernism was a term that was coined. I forget exactly where it first reared its head, but it's often associated with the Bauhaus.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bauhaus has been kind of wrongly slapped as a style. But if you look at the teachers and you look at the work of the teachers, Moholy-Nagy, Clay, Breuer, Albers, their work is all over the place. And the ideas that were bubbling up in the 20s were all over the place. They had a goal as a school to work in the real world. That is, to think of the difference, the way that materials and manufacturing and design kind of go together, at least in the physical world. But when you look at the background, they had these costumes and soirees and worked in every conceivable material, fabric, metal, glass, paint. And Dan's feeling was that it has, modernism became a style largely because he blames it on art historians. Well, let's not get into that, but it's I think he's right that if you keep yourself open, to what makes sense for the constraints of the problem that you're faced with, you're more likely to be in the approach camp than the style camp. You know, a series of formal ideas applied to whatever problem you're faced with. That's not a good plan.
Mm.
And so that's why being ambidextrous, being as full of different experiences, and to have as many of your own abilities developed as possible. I've always felt that the best education is the one that prepares you for the problem you've never even thought about solving. I mean, my own life is like that. I never in a million years would have thought that I would end up spending 35 years working in a television studio. You know, all my teachers had told me, worst possible place you can go apart from advertising to squander your education is to go into television, they told me. But I discovered that this place wasn't about television, it was about education. So it worked out for me. But, you know, try everything.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. What year are you, Xavier?
I'm a junior.
Katie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I was wondering what you think Dan would have thought of, like how modernism has evolved today.
Oh, I don't know how to answer that because I'm struggling myself to say, how has modernism evolved today? I think it's much more eclectic now, even though I would say the standardized Helvetica solution thing that was going on in the 60s, 70s, 80s is less pervasive. Today's visual palette, if you look at it, is very eclectic. And I think, there's a store on Garden Street here in Cambridge that sells modernist furniture. And what they mean by modernist furniture is 50s and 60s. Bent pipe chairs and, sort of furniture and lamps, and it's kind of a melange of Scandinavian and European styles. It's hot now. People want it. I mean, look at what's it called? What's the furniture company that's
Noel,
Noel is the classic.
Design Within Reach.
Design Within Reach. If you go to Design Within Reach, place like that, these are all reissues of 50s and 60s couches and chairs and stuff. But I don't know how to answer it. You tell me. What do you think it is, Katie? What is modernism today?
This is my first design class, so I don't know if I can answer that question either.
Okay, well, I'll give you a couple of years, but it's a hard question. Sorry, I can't help you with that. I think if you read Dan's definition of radical modernism, I think it covers an awful lot of what's happening today. So go read the last part of the end of his book, and you'll see what I mean. Any other questions?
Do we have time for more?
Yeah, I gotta go in 5 minutes.
Okay. I guess what I keep thinking about is that I think your conversation about approach versus style is very interesting and present within his work. And obviously with the ideals of Bauhaus, it's very much material exploration and kind of navigating through I don't know, just the interaction between digital and analog also is present in his work, and kind of how Bauhaus was listen to the body and kind of just let your body do the work and see what happens from that and kind of work through that is very present. And I don't know, I think his search through graphic design and then going towards a medium where he is more present within the work that he was making kind of plays to his ideals on technology. And I don't know if he ever discussed how technology is limiting with bringing the body into the work. I don't know if that sparks any.
I don't. How do you mean technology bringing the body into work?
I just think like with what I've read, like I don't know, I think that like that technology is sometimes like excluding the body, and like I don't know, there needs to be like connection between like analog tech like and technology. So like how
Yeah, but I
did he find those like interactions?
believe that technology, you can think of technology as the medium
Mhm.
for ideas,
Yeah.
the thing that builds them, projects them. But you're not talking about Fitbit or something like that, are you?
No.
No.
I'm just saying like the connection between like analog ideals and using technology to bring like works to another level. Like I feel like in an article that we were assigned, it was saying that he like didn't like relying on technology because like, and I just see in his work like he does a lot of physical like installation, as you like showed with his apartment. Like it seemed like he saw technology as limiting, where like the body could bring more into a space, and the ideals of like material and style and color, like I don't know.
Well, he used many other people to, I mean, think about that hand, pardon my own hand, but uh, to make that object, that shiny object, required, I don't know the story myself, but you know Jeff Koons, the artist? Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, he has probably 45 people working in his,
Yeah.
and he has, you know, manufacturers all over the globe that know how to do that.
Mhm.
What he says is, "Oh, I want the shiny hand with the balls on the tips," and that's the idea. Technology helps build that idea,
Right.
but that body issue that you're talking about, I think was clearly represented by his decision to go with his own personal mental and physical awareness. He wasn't happy at Pentagram. It
Mhm.
wasn't his world. And, um, you know, he was other back then. And he was in the closet. So when he said, okay, I'm out of here, I'm going to do what my, I'll use your word, body tells me, he was much happier. He was
Mhm.
much more productive. He was tight as a spring when he was a teacher. You know, people were worried about him. So in that way, I would say follow your bliss. It's so the best advice I ever got from the medical profession was figure out what you like to do and then do more of that. You know, it's pretty good. Pretty good advice. But with that, I have to leave you. Are you a senior?
I'm a junior as well.
Yeah. And you're thinking about what's next?
Yeah, I definitely like have approaches in ranging mediums as well, and like I kind of relate to the experience that he's going through. Like I think it's interesting how you were saying like how he saw you and your wife as like kind of um like a stamp in time where like he was changing so much, and I feel like I agree with that. Like I feel like I changed so much with like my approaches, so it's like interesting to hear that as well. So I don't know, just navigating everything.
At an earlier moment in our relationship, I would have been offended by that comment. But I mean, you and Esther always stay the same. Well, okay. I gotta go. It's been fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will send you the link.
Thank you.
Thank you.